Good morning, everyone. My name is Olivia Obineme. I am the manager of partnerships and local content at the Better Government Association. I want to say good morning and welcome you to the first full day of sessions at FOIA Fest, 10th annual. And I'm really excited to be here for this first panel, FOIA 101. And it's all that you need to know about public records in Illinois and some things beyond. So we have 50 minutes. I'm gonna get rolling. We will have a presentation for you of fundamentals, like I said earlier, and we'll be taking questions at the end of the session. If you have any questions, please go to the right of your screen and hop in, and there is space to provide some Q&A and to share any insights that you may have about FOIA. Along with me here this morning, we have several awesome experts, and I'm really excited to learn with you all from these great people who have just a plethora of knowledge on FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. So I'll introduce them quickly. We have my colleagues, Jared Rutecki, investigative reporter and data coordinator at the BGA. We have Sidnee King, the equity reporter at the BGA. We also have Jonah Newman, who's the editor at Injustice Watch, a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization in Chicago. And we have Wesley Wright, who is the assistant director of student media at Florida Atlantic University. And we also have Shelley Geiszler, an attorney at Lovie & Lovie, which is a civil rights law firm here in Chicago, with her colleague, Rachel Un, who is the FOIA paralegal and intake coordinator at Lovie & Lovie. Good morning, everyone. How are y'all doing?
Wonderful.
Good, thanks.
Good.
Good.
Good. So, this is such a great annual panel that we have at FOIA Fest. I was lucky to be an attendee last year, and so definitely being inspired by Jared and Sidnee, who were on the previous panel, along with a former colleague of ours, Alejandra. So I'm going to, in the spirit of Alejandra, go into the same approach of, I want to learn FOIA 101, and I want to learn the basics. And I am an emerging, or I can be an established investigative reporter, and I'm looking to refresh or learn some new things about FOIA. So with you all here, I think it's great that we start from the beginning. And Wesley, I kind of want to understand, what is the Freedom of Information Act, and what it all means.
Sure. So just to put, just to be broad, right? The Freedom of Information Act is an act that guarantees or gives citizens, reporters, and otherwise the opportunity to make a request for public documents from government bodies. That was the federal government originally, and as you can see on the slide there, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed an act into law in the 60s that made it on the federal level, and then states like Illinois and the other 49 eventually signed in their own version of those public records acts. So I work here at a college. Olivia mentioned that I work for a public university here in Florida, but the idea that these public bodies answer to people who are taxpayers, right, citizens, that holds whether you're in Illinois or in Florida or in Wyoming or wherever else. There's a idea even among the reporters here that using FOIA is something that like reporters do, but it's some kind of special circumstance, right? Like they're special forces or something. But in reality, any reporter can use it. And I've worked with people who, even if they're not reporters, right? You might have a lawsuit, right? I've known people who have worked, they may have had a car accident, or they had a friend who passed, and they can request records from a coroner in their county, right? Or the state police system. So what the FOIA Act does is we have an opportunity to request these records from the federal government, but the same essence applies to state bodies or local bodies in a similar fashion.
And I think you pointed out a great point about, who can use FOIA. It's something that, you don't have to be a reporter to go into. I think all of us know a number of community members, maybe some of our neighbors who are concerned citizens that have utilized the Freedom of Information Act, or maybe even asked questions about it. Jared, is there anything else you want to add to the history of FOIA? You're quite the expert in the number of FOIA requests you've made and that you make annually.
So, and I think Wesley covered a lot of it really, really well, kind of getting background and whatever else. And I think some of those points are really key. I don't know where everybody's in the audience, but it's kind of an interesting idea that you do have different laws everywhere else kind of set this way. So the way the law works in Florida, different than it works in Illinois, different than it works at the federal level. And it's good kind of to keep track of how all these things go.
And how many FOIA requests have you made in the last year, Jared?
And well, just for this year, I'm up to 1,142 requests since January 1. So my personal record is 2,131, and I hope to beat that someday.
Well, when it comes to getting into that groove of filing so many FOIA requests, obviously you've had the practice to understand what's in a record. And Jonah, I know you also have a lot of experience in that. Can you explain to us, what is in a record, what we're looking for when it comes to filing requests for FOIA?
Yeah, so I think, the term record is generally read pretty broadly, right? Anything, any document, any data, any reports, emails, anything that's in writing or in some digital format that's in the possession of a public body is a record. So that again includes, emails. It includes text messages between public employees. In again, this is in Illinois. I don't know about other states. It includes contracts with private contractors that work for public bodies. It includes any data set that a public body manages or has. So it's really broad. And I think, thinking about records broadly, I sort of like to think any way that sort of a public body conducts its business, or any form that comes into a public body, right? Like any form that you fill out with a government agency, there's some record being kept on the other side of that form, whether in a database or in a filing cabinet somewhere. I think the one thing that's noted on the slide that's important to note is that agencies are not required to create records for you. So you can't, a FOIA request has to look for some particular record, and we're going to get into this a little later, sort of how to craft a request, but you can't just sort of ask a question and hope that the agency responds with an answer if that answer doesn't exist in some sort of physical or electronic record. So there's a list here of some kind of specific types of records that public bodies have to keep. But again, information about employee salaries, employee rosters, emails, documents, reports, police reports, investigations, investigatory files. All those things are records, and best to sort of craft your request as broadly as possible for any kind of records that might exist about a topic.
And Sidnee, you have also been, everyone on here has been, immersed in the world of FOIA. So can you help us understand, with what Jonah said, what is out there in terms of trying to understand what to FOIA for?
Yeah, I think that this can be one of the more intimidating when you're kind of first jumping into FOIA, is figuring out what to ask for. And like Jonah said, you can't ask a question and just hope, that they'll be nice and kind of put things together for you. So there's a couple different ways you can figure out the names of those documents that you're looking for, the types of documents that you're looking for. So one thing you can do is look at retention schedules. A lot of government bodies might have this on their website. Sometimes it's a little difficult to find, but essentially this is just a rundown of like all the types of documents, for example, the police department keeps. And sometimes the schedule isn't like fully updated, you know, so it might be from 10 years ago and the names of documents have changed. But what it does is it gives you an idea of the types of things you should be asking for. Should I be asking for an incident report? Should I be asking for disciplinary records? And then another thing that you can do is like read government board agendas. If you're reading like government meetings, you'll see some of those documents in the agenda. And that can be really helpful in just figuring out the sort of language that you can include in your request to get the documents that you want. And then something that is very, very, very helpful is looking at a previous FOIA requests. So muckrock.com is a great resource for this. You can see lots of other reporters or, you know, just engaged citizens. If they've registered their request, you can find their requests online. There's like a whole section for the Chicago Police Department with requests up until literally yesterday. I checked this morning, and you can find, you know, all types of requests there, and that really helps you kind of cultivate the language that you're looking for. And I think that one thing that's not on this list that's really helpful is, and we'll talk about FOIA officers, but just dialing the phone number and calling a FOIA officer and saying, hey, I'm looking for this sort of information. Would you be able, you know, can you help me figure out what type of document I'd be looking for and what I should include in the request? And that also just helps with the process in general, having a name and a face to connect with the request. And the last thing is that you can FOIA other FOIAs. So if you don't know exactly what you're looking for, you can, you know, FOIA request for the specific topic that you've been talking about. And that really helps kind of reduce that intimidation factor when you begin submitting your first requests.
And you kind of already got into this, you know, all of that leads to, you know, what exactly can people FOIA for? You know, there are so many avenues within government agencies, and there's different things that, you know, people have complaints about in their neighborhoods, their communities, but they're not sure, you know, what's the next step? How do you actually go through the process? And even if it's something that they can actually get public records for. So Sidnee, take us through that too, into, you know, what types of things, you know, people can be looking for when it comes to public records.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's such a breadth of information of things that can be requested. A lot of times we request data sets, but I also think it's interesting with requesting communication between government bodies, government officials, personnel files. I mentioned like disciplinary records. If you're talking about public safety officials, there's just so many things that you can do. And another thing that's interesting when you're submitting FOIA requests is when you're submitting a request and you're thinking, you know, a government body should be keeping track of this sort of information, and you find out that they don't, you know, that's another interesting perspective to get through FOIA requesting. You know, you realize, oh, the government is not keeping track of this vital information. And that's just kind of another way to figure things out.
And Jared, it's good to know, you know, the types of records you can request, but obviously, you know, you have to get into specifics when you are talking to particularly government agencies. It's hard enough to, you know, get some transparency on certain things. So can you get a little bit more specific about, especially the slide here that we have for folks on records you could request and how to kind of request them?
Yeah, and we've covered what are these records, you know, what are you looking for? But like, you know, sometimes you say, I want everything about, and you get, you know, sometimes if you're thinking about it, you get a ton of stuff there and it becomes sort of a problem for them to produce, which is something that we'll get into a little later in the process. But like, there's a lot of different ways where you can think about how am I going to ask for these records, or kind of pointing at them. So this is the kind of way that some of these sort of sets are built. So it's like, I want the top one here, general records. I want all of the records referencing the police shooting of this individual. I want all of the records related to all documents and data related to this sort of this company, whichever else, go over whichever imaginary kind of agency that you're sending a records request to, and that's like the grab bag, give me everything you have sort of request. There's a couple of other ways to think about it, like a parameter-based request that we have down here. So this is like, let's say you're asking for emails and you say, I don't want every email from these people, but I would like to see every email between the mayor and the chief of staff between January 1st and January 14th. Or I would like to see all of the contracts and transactions between the city and this company between these dates. So kind of thinking of it rather than like, well, we have millions of transactions with these people, narrowing it a little bit so it gives you only what you're asking for. Then there's thinking of it more specifically with specific requests. I would like to see I'm asking for the contract between the city of Chicago and the ABC company. I'm looking for all the contract between this individual and the county, all of these sort of ideas. And the last one that I have on here is like a data. I do a lot of data requests and kind of thinking of data, and Jonah mentioned data as a request, thinking that I want all of the records from the Chicago police arrest database from January 1st to the present, or from the last 5 years, or, I want all of the data on carjacking arrests from these time periods, kind of these ends. And there's sort of a couple of important things to think of this way. Like sometimes that there's a database out there. Someone references it in legislature or they say something about it. Sometimes you don't know, but it's kind of the reverse engineering that Jonah described. There's these documents. So what are they doing with these documents? They're entering them in somewhere. So you become smart enough looking at some of those documents to go from a database where you keep it and you have like fields listed on this form. So you say, I would like all of this information, which you can kind of get reverse engineering it that way. But sometimes it's a good idea to kind of educate yourself a little bit about what's out there before you get to making these requests.
And so sorry if I mispronounced your name, Luan Huska. You asked who is a FOIA officer, and you couldn't have better timing in that because we have given you all kind of a little bit of overview, and we're about to get into a little bit of deeper dive into these basics. And of course, we want to know who we're talking about when it comes to FOIA officer, FOIA office, and Sidnee, can you share what a FOIA officer is, or what a FOIA office is that someone would need to send their request to?
Yeah, so a FOIA officer, or in some instances, they're called public information officers. They're basically the go-between. They're the person between your request and you getting the documents that you wanted. So when you submit a FOIA request, you're supposed to do it in writing in Illinois. Some government bodies have kind of like their online systems. You fill out a form, or they have like a website where you submit it digitally. Some take it via email, but the FOIA officer is really the person who's going to be managing getting the request fulfilled for you. And so in Illinois and in Chicago, there's websites where there's FOIA contacts for every government body, like for the police department, the fire department, the county treasurer, all of that good stuff. Sometimes, things change and they don't get updated as quickly. So sometimes it's easier to just call to figure out who that person is. But my recommendation like I said previously, before submitting a request, especially when you're doing it early on, is to call the FOIA officer and get a sense of what they're looking for, or the language that they're looking for in a request, and the best way to go about requesting your records so that it's as painless of a process as possible. And FOIA officers do have to complete a training once a year. They're not required to register with a public access counselor. And sometimes when you get into smaller municipalities, like in Chicago, a lot of the government bodies have a dedicated person whose 24/7 job is to do FOIA. But in some cases, when you get into smaller cities, it might be, a person who has 6 jobs and one of their jobs is fulfilling FOIA requests. So it just kind of depends based on agency to agency. But the most important thing is forming a relationship with the FOIA officer, especially if you know that you're going to be requesting from them often.
So, and just real quick, Sidnee, anyone else, when it comes to making those relationships, again, you don't have to be an investigative reporter to do that, right?
No, you can, it is anyone's prerogative. As Wesley said, everybody has the opportunity to request this information. So you don't have to be a reporter, you don't have to be an attorney. Just, pick up the phone and say, I'm doing this pursuant to the Freedom of Information Act. And that person is required to take your request.
Now, when it comes to FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, which a law, a statute, there's obviously some limitations, and that's been an ongoing conversation when it comes to transparency of government agencies and the public records that they hold. What are the exemptions? What are people needing to know when it comes to what they won't be able to request for?
Yeah, I can take this one. First, I saw Brady's question in the chat about, are there patterns about FOIA officers sort of willingness to cooperate or interest in supporting or undermining transparency? And I think that's a great question. And honestly, just from my experience, and Jared probably can answer this even better than I can, I think it definitely varies agency to agency and FOIA officer to FOIA officer. I've had experiences with some FOIA officers who went on to become sources for me, telling me, things I should request and things going on at their agency because they really were open to, to transparency and wanted to shine a light. And I've had FOIA officers who seem sort of committed to finding every way to claim an exemption, to withhold information. So I think, some of that is probably individual. Some of that is probably the guidance or direction they're getting from their supervisors. I do think it's important to remember, and Sidnee made this point too, like FOIA officers are people. This is their job that they do, day in, day out. Honestly, it's not a particularly enviable one from my perspective, because they're often stuck in the middle, right, between requesters who really want something and the other people at their agency who actually have the records, right? Most of the time, especially if you're dealing with a big agency, the FOIA officer doesn't actually have the records with them, right? They have to go find them from whatever department or person actually holds those records. So they're sort of an in-between. And so just sort of keeping that in mind and realizing, like, again, you can get a pretty good sense, especially after you've been working with a FOIA officer. Are they really trying their best to help you, or are they trying their best to thwart you? But I think, just dealing with them on a human level has often been a good rule of thumb for me. So just talking quickly about exemptions. So yeah, there are obviously things that public bodies do not have to provide you, and those are things that are exempt from FOIA. And there's a range. It ranges from personally identifiable information about individuals. So that's everything from social security numbers and birth dates, home addresses, personal phone numbers, even like signatures of public officials can be redacted within FOIA because the signature is personally identifiable. Things like drafts or internal memos. So there's a whole exemption related both for Illinois and the federal FOIA related to preliminary drafts or things that are not sort of in final form. And that's, I would say, an exemption that sometimes gets overused. So sort of trying to navigate that can be a little tricky. I also just point out that for Illinois, once the head of a public body has referenced a record, it can no longer be claimed as a preliminary draft. So just that's a little loophole there. In some information about sort of ongoing law enforcement investigations or national security type investigations are things that that are exempt from FOIA. Again, a note that in Illinois, the public agency has to show that giving up that information about a pending investigation is likely to actually impede the investigation, and so it's on them to prove that. There's a great note here that says, read exemptions carefully, make sure they apply to your case. I always say, like, read the FOIA law itself, and we can put links in the chat if we don't have them, because that can really give you an upper hand if an agency claims an exemption to try to sort of appeal, and we'll talk about the appeals process in a little bit. And then the other thing is the whole process is, when an agency claims that something is exempt, they are the ones who have to prove that it's exempt. You don't have to prove that it's not exempt. And so, that's sort of a mindset, I think, that can be helpful going into it, even if you're not going to end up actually taking this to court or filing a lawsuit to try to get records. The process is built that the agency has the burden of proof, not you as the requester, that something is exempt. So, pushing back a little bit when an agency claims something is exempt from FOIA is always a good rule of thumb.
And just quickly, Jonah, we have a question about are there exemptions regarding incidents involving minors? Can you answer that real quick?
Yeah, so definitely, in sort of all walks of areas of life. So there's exemptions for juvenile court records. There's exemptions for juvenile police records, health records, even school records. If they could identify an individual student, are exempt as well. So the other category that I'm not sure is on here is there's a whole section of anything that is explicitly exempt under another law. So there's lots of other laws that sort of intersect with FOIA. So laws like HIPAA, which protects individuals' health information, or FERPA, which protects student educational information. Those laws can intersect with FOIA in ways that make information about some of those topics exempt.
And I love that you all are chiming in. We'll answer your questions as we continue to go. And again, great with timing. Sebastian is asking, is there a used or recommended general template to request information, or does it change depending on what department has the records? I know, Wesley, you put in there a automatically generated template, which those exist. BJ has one too. Let's dive a little deeper in that. Now that we know what's exempted, we have a little bit of a feel into what we can FOIA for. Jared, can you take us through how to write a FOIA request and what Sebastian is asking about when it comes to templating FOIA request letters?
Yeah, and that the Student Press Law Center link that Wesley provided, I think, is really good. Like, those are one. You have a lot of stuff online. Obviously, BGA, like, we do a lot of stuff with FOIA. We kind of have a link here that goes to your how do I write a FOIA end of things. But a number of these other resources are very helpful for you to be able to do these things, kind of like kind of training wheels in some of these ends, and you can kind of put these things together. There's a lot of like Muckrock kind of has a little bit of, I guess, what I would describe as a GUI kind of system, where it's like you pick the agency, get the connection to it, you just plug in, describe the records you're looking for, and they'll run the whole request together for you. Those work relatively reasonable. In terms of like educational resources, there's a number of other useful ones. Groups like IRE have very good kind of FOIA education. That's like, this is one that you have other organizationally. And I think kind of what we're seeing in BGA that's very helpful to help us kind of how do you write FOIAs and these things, depending on what state you live in or where you're coming from, or like, you're like, oh God, I got to get records in another state. Like, there are other organizations that do this. There are groups in almost every state where people have these things, or local groups. So sometimes it might be a good idea just to plug yourself in with somebody like the people on this panel, or someone else who might be able to kind of lead you along, like, take a look at something before you send it. So a lot of tools out there for you.
And we have some parts of the FOIA request letter here. Can you kind of go through, especially some of the words and the phrasing that we've highlighted?
Yeah, and this is probably the part where everybody gets terrified, because it looks like the drug side effect warnings, where you're like reading everything and it's in here and you're like, oh my God, do I have to like craft it with this level of precision and everything else? And it's like, don't think of it, like, try not to think of it as like very intimidating. I mean, in Illinois, the simplest request would be, I'm under the Illinois Public Records request, I'm public records law, I'm asking for blank. And then you put it, that's all you got to do. It's a written request, you're putting it in. I think what this kind of shows, you have a lot of pieces in this writing here that's essentially, I like to think of them as friendly reminders. The FOIA law is putting everything in there for everybody, but you're telling people, this is what I'm asking for under the Illinois Freedom of Information Act, citing the statute, putting it in here. Don't need to cite the statute. That's just the way I have it. And then unlikely kind of you're redacting it. You're saying, hey, I need you to tell me why. Why are you redacting this? Why aren't you giving me these records? This piece in here. And so it's essentially telling somebody to give it. You have another line in here that kind of is very common for something I'm doing. If the records are kept electronically, please provide them that way. This is another kind of line that I throw into a number of requests because people will charge you for copies. At least in Illinois, electronic documents don't kind of take that off the table. You're not making copies, you're essentially making an electronic document. So this is one way to kind of reduce the sort of catch of paying for some of these things, at least in this state. And I got another kind of line in here with the nonprofit asking for waivers. This applies to a number of people. So you have nonprofits, anybody working in public radio, nonprofit newsrooms can make this to kind of request a fee waiver. This also applies to students and things like that, academics. So essentially in Illinois, you can say, hey, I'm a student, could you please waive the fee? So they go, if they start charging you for copies or whatever else, this is you putting in the request. It's not guaranteed that they're going to give it to you, but they're not going to give it to you if you don't ask. So I kind of the way this was described, you can cut and paste some of these and kind of fill in the blanks for yourself. But I sometimes run my request that way, where I'm using the similar request, and you do some parts kind of in pieces. So it's depends on how you get to it.
And you talk a little bit about this, but let's help everyone in terms of trying to get the odds in their favor when it comes to putting their letter together. What's the point about really focusing the request for any type of public agency?
Yeah, and this is something I think we've talked a lot, and people have said you can't use FOIA to ask a question. And this is kind of, I guess, an idea where I think of memorizing all the rules of the game so that you know how these things work. You can't say, hey, tell me what the answer to this is, but there's creative ways that you can word this so that you're almost asking a question, but you're not asking a question. I would like documents sufficient to show all of this. So you're not asking a question, you're asking for all the documents related to something. It may be answering a question for you, but the way that you've worded it essentially works within federal FOIA, Illinois FOIA, most of these other ends. So it's kind of thinking about policies and procedures related to or regarding or referencing or those sorts of pieces. Everyone has taken this with the documents in the way that you want them, printed, electronic, even file formats. This gets to be real tricky when you're working with data stuff. In the state of Illinois in particular, they're required to provide the documents in the form in which they're kept. So somebody is not supposed to take their Excel spreadsheet, run it through a PDF, and then copy it 7 times on their fax machine in the office so that you can't do anything with it. If they've got it as a Excel file, a CSV file, they're required to give it to you in that form. And sometimes people don't know any better. They just get it sent off to them. So this is kind of when Jonah was talking about, and somebody had asked earlier, what does pushing back look like? It's like they give you the request and you go, they don't have to pick the phone up, but you can make the call. You pick the phone up and say, hey, I got this for you, and I'm looking at it, and this is definitely a spreadsheet. So somebody in your office has got to have a spreadsheet, right? You didn't just go out on this. You didn't type all this stuff in by hand. So would I be able to get that spreadsheet? Just could you ask somebody where it came from or those end of things? It doesn't mean they're going to cooperate with you, but kind of doing your due diligence, it's important to ask for that kind of stuff. And the last point that's on here is kind of the narrowing focus, which there's a really good binding PAC decision that came out in Illinois in the past year where that actually requires FOIA officers to make themselves available for the narrow request. I think it used to be a real common technique to require people to narrow their request and never talk to them again. And now they are, at least in Illinois, required to talk with you, to work with you to narrow the request. So that's kind of a legal precedent, at least from the Attorney General's office, that allows you to get them on the phone so that if they say, hey, you're asking for too much, you can say, hey, instead of giving me 10 years, can you just give me 1 year and I'll repeat these requests every year? Or instead of giving me emails from all these 50 people, why don't I cut it down to this list of 5 people or something like that? So just thinking of it as a way to kind of reel it back in a little bit if they're saying it's too much.
And I'm glad we have attorneys on this call as well. Jared, you can kind of kick it off here. After we've made that request, we've focused in on what exactly we're looking for. We've sent that letter in. Let's talk about, also how long it takes for the response, and then breaking down, what responses look like when it comes to FOIA statute here in Illinois, and also, generally when it comes to federal requests.
Yeah, this has kind of it fits in wherever you're asking everybody, I think, like what you get for these rules. But yeah, you basically have a timer that starts. In most of these, it's typically when the FOIA is received. There's a little bit more of a gray area in terms of when that day starts and what time you send it and all those sorts of things. But basically in Illinois, you're saying 5 business days they're required to make the response. So it's essentially you send the request on Monday in the morning, then by basically next Monday. So it's business days, not calendar days. So Saturday and Sunday don't count. The 4th of July doesn't count. Christmas Day, all of these major holidays kick it off. So essentially the same sort of, I guess, days when you get to go to your bank, essentially 5 of those days. Now in Illinois, they're allowed to ask for an extension, which can be granted up to 5 days. So similar, kicks it back to the next week. Most agencies, particularly City of Chicago, almost immediately CPS will extend like at the first minute you send the request. So this is something to keep in mind. And your final result, not getting a response is a denial, whether they've sent you a denial in Illinois or not, that works. The federal kind of runs on a slightly different calendar. You got 20 business days for them to make a determination. The frustrating part with federal FOIA is they will make a determination and it might take them just an unbelievable amount of time. That there's not really a set clock on some of these things. I've gotten some records back quickly, but it's definitely a much slower churning kind of mechanism. And there's one thing that you can ask for in this is making an expedited request. Something you can ask for in the federal request. This is something that I've succeeded at one single time, which was asking me and the other 45,000 people asking for the Mueller report. They successfully gave me the Mueller report on an expedited FOIA request. I've failed at every other single expedited FOIA request I've made, but that's kind of where we ran in. I think probably Shelley and Rachel have a universe more of knowledge onto this than I do. Maybe if they could add something else or kind of things that people should focus on.
Yeah, Shelley, I know I ran past Jonah here too, but Shelley and Rachel, in terms of federal requests, is there anything else you can add to that?
Rachel might have more knowledge. A lot of my cases are Illinois cases. I will say that the deadlines in Illinois are really important when it comes into if a public body doesn't respond to the request on time and then tries to say later on that the request is unduly burdensome, they waive being able to do that if they fail to respond on time to the request. So that's an instance where like the deadlines are applied really strictly and the statute is set up that way. So they really do come into play. If a public body is just not responding at all and then later tries to say there's too much for us to do with this, they can't do that if they fail to respond on time.
For federal FOIA, I think expedited processing can help, but there are certain conditions you have to show for the agency to grant expedited processing. And so what I recommend is you should read the statute if you can, and then really, and they ask you to certify your statement. So you're essentially saying that this is true to my belief and knowledge. So the bar is a little higher, but as Jared said, if the event is very current and in the news today, you would be able to show that. But the system itself is broken. So even if you get the expedited processing granted, a lot of times you still have to wait months. So I think just tampering the expectations, especially for federal FOIAs, could be helpful.
And when we do finally get our request approved and we're given copies, or we're given records, what does it mean to utilize that information and utilize the documents that we do receive from public agencies?
Who is that? Back to me. Who are you asking?
Yeah, Shelley and Rachel. Shelley and Rachel, Jared, feel free to chime in. Jonah, y'all have experience in this. Teach me.
Could you maybe just repeat the question? I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. So when, we end up getting a green light with our FOIA requests, and we receive documents to go through, what does it mean to, utilize that information? Can we make copies? What do folks do with the documents that they receive?
Yeah, once the documents are public records, they're public records. So you're allowed to do with them. You're allowed to report on them. You're allowed to do essentially what you want with them. That's public information that you can analyze and report on however you see fit.
Yeah, I think that's really good. It's like there's something like, what are you going to do with these kind of things? And you get them from the copies, and sometimes you ask, oh my God, is it worth paying this much for this or whatever else? But these are really good. Some of these documents, you think of like police reports, like nobody's talking to you. Some of these things do give you a peek inside what's happening, how things work, like these end of things. And it's almost the only way that you can get things sometimes when people aren't talking to you or aren't sharing stuff with you. So it's really important, kind of, you weigh these things. And this has kind of a lot of rules for like what people pay for these and whatever else, but you kind of want to weigh those a little bit while you're doing it.
And so everyone knows, I've pinned in the chat to your right link to our presentation. So we have embedded links in the presentation throughout the slides. So everything from the statutes to looking into templates and whatnot, you can find that all in our FOIA 101 presentation. When it comes to, getting denied, that happens more times than we know for, I think, everyone here on this panel. What does that look like? What is the experience? Can you share that journey and what, it means to be rejected, for your FOIA request? I'll start with you, Sidnee.
Yeah. So just like all along the process, the government body is required to submit the denial in a written form via a letter. You might get an email, or it might be like via that database that you got or that you used. And it's always a bummer to get denied. I think the best way and the least arduous way to go about kind of figuring out if you can get that rectified is by contacting the FOIA officer again and kind of figuring out if you can narrow the request, if you can revise the request. A lot of times, most of my denials are because the request is unduly burdensome, which essentially means that it's just way too much work for the agency to provide the request or the records that I've requested. So sometimes that might mean narrowing down to, kind of like Jared said before, narrowing down to a certain period of time, or breaking up your request. If you're asking for, the disciplinary records of 15 individuals, maybe doing 2 people at a time per request. And this is something that's kind of like just trial by error. You learn as you go along. But if that, a revision or a narrowing of the request doesn't work, you the great redaction. So this is another way that you're not denied, but essentially you are, right? You request your records and you get them back, and everything is blacked out, right? Everything is redacted because they've claimed some sort of exemption on the information, and that is very frustrating. So like I was saying, you can reach out to the FOIA officer and try to revise the request, or there's the option to submit an appeal. And that is a difficult process, but you do have 60 days. And I think Rachel is gonna jump in and talk a little bit more about the appeal process, but you have 60 days to appeal once you've been denied, or you can file a lawsuit because if the agency is not following the law the way they should and are denying information that that you should have access to, the ability to file a lawsuit on the state level or on the federal level is also a resource that you have. I don't know, Rachel, if you want to add.
Yeah, I will. Thank you, Sidnee. So for Illinois, we do have a public access counselor, which is an office in the Attorney General's office. So you would write them. Essentially, it can be very simple. You can say, this is my request. They denied it under these exemptions, and they have not shown they have not demonstrated with detailed factual basis how the records are exempt. And more often, well, I guess it depends, but the Attorney General's office then will initiate a review, which would require the public body to explain why you claim those exemptions. A lot of times those letters can be helpful to figure out, like, what are these records? Like, why do these exemptions apply? Because the denial letters can be very simple and not helpful at all. They might just copy and paste the statute, which doesn't really explain much. So that process can be very helpful. And then you will get a chance to respond to the public body, and that's it. So I believe the public body does not get to respond to your reply. So then the public access counselor will take their time and issue a determination. And this process is free, which is very helpful as well.
Now I know we have about 5 minutes, so I want us to really kind of get into the nitty-gritty of some of the federal aspects of FOIA. Rachel and Shelley, would you like to take this on in terms of the outlook of federal appeals?
Shelley, did you want me to do it? Sorry.
To the federal appeals, that'd be great.
Okay, so for federal appeals,
Okay.
yeah, you can chime in if I missed anything. Let me give it my best shot. For federal appeals, you have 90 calendar days since the date of the denial letter, and that's very important. Some federal agencies will allow you to submit it on the 92nd day, but they don't have to. So that deadline is really important. If you don't appeal that, you don't get to have your day in court, and you have to start over. And these are for denials. If they just straight up don't respond for 6 months, then that request is considered denial, and you're also considered to have exhausted your administrative remedies, which is the phrase that they use for federal FOIAs, and you can take that to court right away. But in terms of the federal appeals itself, they will explain, they are supposed to explain where to send the appeals, and then the instructions. So similarly, you could say the agencies have not shown how these records, have not demonstrated how these records are exempt under X, Y, and Z. In my experience, it doesn't have to be a 6-page essay. It can be simple. Again, the burden is on the government agency to show why the records are exempt. And this process is also free. And after you submit the appeal, they have 20 business days to adjudicate the appeal. Sometimes it gets remanded, and then whoever is adjudicating the appeal will tell the agency you have to do another search, or you have to unredact certain parts, and that will go through the process again.
And just quickly to, a segue into that is just thinking about some of those misconceptions too, right, Rachel?
Yeah,
I'm gonna let Shelley take that over. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is speaking just specifically about the Illinois statute. So the first misconception is you can't get emails or text messages from private devices, and this isn't true. The appellate court has held that when public officials are conducting public business, even if they're using private email addresses or texts, on their personal devices, those records are still public records, and you can get them through FOIA. Second misconception is records in the possession of private businesses are never subject to FOIA. The statute actually has a provision that speaks directly to this. So if a public body contracts with a private party, and that private party is performing a government function, then any records in the possession of that private entity that directly relate to that government function, those are also FOIAble. The third one is public bodies can use the ongoing investigation exemption as a blanket exemption to withhold records. We've touched on this a little bit when we were talking about exemptions. So this comes up in like law enforcement issues a lot. So they can't just say, oh, there's an ongoing investigation, we're going to withhold all these records. They have to assess each document individually, so that's on a document by document basis. And they also have to show that the records would interfere. So it's a higher standard. It's not maybe it'll interfere, it's would interfere. Fourth misconception, public bodies can redact any deliberative discussions under Section 7.1(f). That's the deliberative process privilege. And that's not true either. The discussions have to pertain to government policy. So they can't just be any old back and forth discussions. They have to be something that actually pertains to the policies of the public body. And they also can't redact factual material either. So where there's factual material kind of intertwined, that information needs to be released. And we've had some success in court with judges reviewing records in camera and releasing additional information because the public body was overusing the exemption. And then finally, the last misconception is only people who could afford lawyers can sue a public body for violating FOIA. And this thankfully is not true. Both the federal FOIA and the Illinois FOIA have a fee shifting provision. So that allows you to bring a lawsuit and your attorney can recoup the costs under the under the statute if they prevail in the lawsuit. So this is really great. It really shows that the General Assembly values the public's ability to enforce their rights to public information under FOIA.
I just want to make sure that we're mindful of time. So I want to let you all know, again, we have all of our contact information and a plethora of links. And yes, Brady, including links that can take you to summarizing or giving you some better notes about the statutes in our presentation. And please utilize that, share that with others who are also looking into learning more and putting in their own FOIA requests. I want to thank all of our panelists, Wesley, Sidney, Jared, Jonah, Shelley, Rachel. Thank you all so much for giving so much insight. This has been such a quick but great burst of energy and getting started for FOIA Fest. And like I said, y'all, find them on our slides, their content information, and we'd be happy to answer any questions following. Have a great rest of FOIA Fest.